Chapter 10. The Law Writer. On the eastern borders of Chancery Lane, that is to say, more particularly in Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, Mr. Snagsby, law stationer, pursues his lawful calling. In the shade of Cook's Court, at most times a shady place, Mr. Snagsby has dealt in all sorts of blank forms of legal processes, in skins and rolls of parchment, in paper, foolscap, brief draft, brown, white, whitey brown, and blotting, in stamps, in office quills, pens, ink, india rubber, pounce, pins, pencils, sealing wax and wafers, in red tape and green ferret, in pocket books, almanacs, diaries, and law lists, in string boxes, rulers, inkstands, glass and leaden, penknives, scissors, bodkins, and other small office cutlery. In short, in articles too numerous to mention. Ever since he was out of his time and went into partnership with Peffer, on that occasion Cook's Court was in a manner revolutionized by the new inscription in fresh paint, Peffer and Snagsby, displacing the time-honoured and not easily to be deciphered legend, Peffer only. For smoke, which is the London ivy, had so wreathed itself around Peffer's name and clung to his dwelling place that the affectionate parasite quite overpowered the parent tree. Peffer is never seen in Cook's Court now. He is not expected there, for he has been recumbent this quarter of a century in the churchyard of St. Andrew's, Holborn, with the waggons and hackney coaches roaring past him all the day and half the night like one great dragon, if he ever steal forth when the dragon is at rest to air himself again in Cook's Court, until admonished to return by the crowing of the sanguine cock in the cellar at the little dairy in Cursitor Street, whose ideas of daylight it would be curious to ascertain, since he knows from his personal observation next to nothing about it. If Peffer ever do revisit the pale glimpses of Cook's Court, which no law stationer in the trade can positively deny, he comes invisibly, and no one is the worse or wiser. In his lifetime, and likewise in the period of Snagsby's time of 7 long years, there dwelt with Peffer in the same law stationering premises a niece, a short, shrewd niece, something too violently compressed about the waist, and with a sharp nose like a sharp autumn evening, inclining to be frosty towards the end. The Cook's courtiers had a rumour flying among them that the mother of this niece did, in her daughter's childhood, moved by too jealous a solicitude that her figure should approach perfection, lace her up every morning with her maternal foot against the bedpost for a stronger hold and purchase, and further that she exhibited internally pints of vinegar and lemon juice, which acids, they held, had mounted to the nose and temper of the patient. With whichsoever of the many tongues of rumour this frothy report originated, it either never reached or never influenced the ears of young Snagsby, who, having wooed and won its fair subject on his arrival at man's estate, entered into 2 partnerships at once. So now in Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, Mr. Snagsby and the niece are one, and the niece still cherishes her figure, which, however tastes may differ, is unquestionably so far precious that there is mighty little of it. Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby are not only one bone and one flesh, but, to the neighbours' thinking, one voice too. That voice, appearing to proceed from Mrs. Snagsby alone, is heard in Cook's Court very often. Mr. Snagsby, otherwise than as he finds expression through these dulcet tones, is rarely heard. He is a mild, bald, timid man with a shining head and a scrubby clump of black hair sticking out at the back. He tends to meekness and obesity, as he stands at his door in Cook's Court in his grey shopcoat and black calico sleeves, looking up at the clouds, or stands behind a desk in his dark shop with a heavy flat ruler, snipping and slicing at sheepskin in company with 2 of his prentices. He is emphatically a retiring and unassuming man. From beneath his feet at such times, as from a shrill ghost unquiet in its grave, there frequently arise complainings and lamentations in the voice already mentioned, and haply on some occasions when these reach a sharper pitch than usual, Mr. Snagsby mentions to the prentices, I think my little woman is giving it to Augusta." This proper name, so used by Mr. Snagsby, has before now sharpened the wit of the cook's courtiers to remark that it ought to be the name of Mrs. Snagsby, seeing that she might with great force and expression be termed Augusta in compliment to her stormy character. It is, however, the possession, and only the possession, except 50 shillings per annum, and a very small box indifferently filled with clothing, of a lean young woman from a workhouse, by some supposed to have been christened Augusta, who, although she was farmed or contracted for during her growing time by an amiable benefactor of his species resident in Tooting, and cannot fail to have been developed under the most favourable circumstances, has fits which the parish can't account for. Augusta, really aged 3 or 4 and 20, but looking around 10 years older, goes cheap with this unaccountable drawback of fits, and is so apprehensive of being returned on the hands of her patron saint that, except when she is found with her head in the pail or in the sink or the copper or the dinner or anything else that happens to be near her at the time of her seizure, she is always at work. She is a satisfaction to the parents and guardians of the apprentices, who feel that there is little danger of her inspiring tender emotions in the breast of youth. She is a satisfaction to Mrs. Snagsby, who can always find fault with her. She is a satisfaction to Mr. Snagsby, who thinks it a charity to keep her. The law stationer's establishment, in Gusta's eyes, a temple of plenty and splendour. She believes the little drawing-room upstairs, always kept, as one may say, with its hair in papers and its pinafore on, to be the most elegant apartment in Christendom. The view it commands of Cook's Court at one end, not to mention a squint into Cursitor Street, and of Covans's, the sheriff's officer's backyard, at the other, she regards as a prospect of unequalled beauty. The portraits it displays in oil, and plenty of it too, of Mr. Snagsby looking at Mrs. Snagsby, and of Mrs. Snagsby looking at Mr. Snagsby, are in her eyes achievements of Raphael or Titian. Augusta has some recompenses for her many privations. Mr. Snagsby refers everything, not in the practical mysteries of the business, to Mrs. Snagsby. She manages the money, she reproaches the tax gatherers, appoints the times and places of devotion on Sundays, licenses Mr. Snagsby's entertainments, and acknowledges no responsibilities what she thinks fit to provide for dinner, insomuch that she is the high standard of comparison among the neighbouring wives in a long way down Chancery Lane on both sides, and even out in Holborn, who, in any domestic passages of arms, habitually call upon their husbands to look at the difference between their, the wives', position and Mr. Snagsby's, and their, the husbands', behaviour and Mr. Snagsby's. Rumour always flying bat-like about Cook's Court and skimming in and out at everybody's windows, does say that Mr. Snagsby is jealous and inquisitive, and that Mr. Snagsby is sometimes worried out of house and home, and that if he had the spirit of a mouse he wouldn't stand it. It is even observed that the wives who quote him to their self-willed husbands as a shining example, in reality look down upon him, and that nobody does so with greater superciliousness than one particular lady whose lord is more than suspected of laying his umbrella on her as an instrument of correction. But these vague whisperings may arise from Mr. Snagsby's being in his way rather a meditative and poetical man, loving to walk in Staple Inn in the summer time, and to observe how countrified the sparrows and leaves are, also to lounge about the Rolls Yard of a Sunday afternoon, and to remark, if in good spirits, that there were old times once, that you'd find a stone coffin or two now under that chapel, he'll be bound, if you was to dig for it. He solaces his imagination too by thinking of the many chancellors and vices and masters of the rolls who are deceased, and he gets such a flavour of the country out of telling the two prentices how he has heard say that a brook as clear as crystal once ran right down the middle of Holborn, when turnstile really was a turnstile, leading slap away into the meadows, gets such a flavour of the country out of this that he never wants to go there. The day is closing in and the gas is lighted, but it is not yet fully effective, for it is not quite dark. Mr. Snagsby, standing at his shop door looking up at the clouds, sees a crow who is out late skim westward over the slice of sky belonging to Cook's Court. The Crow flies straight across Chancery Lane and Lincoln's Inn Garden into Lincoln's Inn Fields. Here, in a large house, formerly a house of state, lives Mr. Tulkinghorn. It is let off in sets of chambers now, and in those shrunken fragments of its greatness lawyers lie like maggots in nuts. But its roomy staircases, passages, and antechambers still remain, and even its painted ceilings, where allegory in Roman helmet and celestial linen sprawls among balustrades and pillars, flowers, clouds, and big-legged boys, and makes the head ache, as would seem to be allegory's object always, more or less. Here, among his many boxes, labelled with transcendent names, lives Mr. Tulkinghorn. When not speechlessly at home in country houses, where the great ones of the earth are bored to death, here he is today, quiet at his table, an oyster of the old school, whom nobody can open. Like as he is to look at, so is his apartment in the dusk of the present afternoon, rusty, out of date, withdrawing from attention, able to afford it. Heavy, broad-backed, old-fashioned mahogany and horsehair chairs, not easily lifted, obsolete tables with spindle legs and dusty baize covers, presentation prints of the holders of great titles in the last generation, or the last but one, enver on him. A thick and dingy Turkey carpet muffles the floor where he sits, attended by 2 candles in old-fashioned silver candlesticks that give a very insufficient light to his large room. The titles on the backs of his books have retired into the binding. Everything that can have a lock has got one. No key is visible. Very few loose papers are about it. He has some manuscript near him, but is not referring to it. With the round top of an inkstand and 2 broken bits of sealing wax, he is silently and slowly working out whatever train of indecision is in his mind. Now the inkstand top is in the middle, now the red bit of sealing wax, now the black bit. If that's not it, Mr. Tulkinghorn must gather them all up and begin again. Here beneath the painted ceiling, with foreshortened allegory staring down at his intrusion as if it meant to swoop upon him, and he cutting it dead, Mr. Tulkinghorn has at once his house and office. He keeps no staff, only one middle-aged man, usually a little out at elbows, who sits in a high pew in the hall and is rarely overburdened with business. Mr. Tulkinghorn is not in a common way. He wants no clerks. He is a great reservoir of confidences, not to be so tapped. His clients want him. He is all in all. Drafts that he requires to be drawn are drawn by special pleaders in the Temple on mysterious instructions. Fair copies that he requires to be made are made at the stationer's expense, being no consideration. The middle-aged man in the pew knows scarcely more of the affairs of the peerage than any crossing sweeper in Holborn. The red bit, the black bit, the inkstand top, the other inkstand top, the little sandbox, so you to the middle, you to the right, you to the left. This train of indecision must surely be worked out now or never. Now Mr. Tulkinghorn gets up and adjusts his spectacles, puts on his hat, puts the manuscript in his pocket, goes out, tells the middle-aged man out at elbows, "I shall be back presently." Very rarely tells him anything more explicit. Mr. Tulkinghorn goes as the Crow came, not quite so straight, but nearly, to Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, to Snagsby's law stationers, deeds engrossed and copied, law writing executed in all its branches, and so on, and so on, and so on. It is somewhere about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and a balmy fragrance of warm tea hovers in Cook's Court. It hovers about Snagsby's door. The hours are early there, dinner at 1:30 and supper at 9:30. Mr. Snagsby was about to descend into the subterranean regions to make tea, when he looked out of his door just now and saw the Crow, who was out late. "Master at home?" Guster is minding the shop for the prentices to take tea in the kitchen with Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby. Consequently, the robe-maker's 2 daughters, combing their curls at the 2 glasses in the 2 second-floor windows of the opposite house, are not driving the two prentices to distraction, as they fondly suppose, but are merely awakening the unprofitable imagination of Guster, whose hair won't grow and never would, and it is confidently thought never will. "Master at home?" says Mr. Tulkinghorn. Master is at home, and Guster will fetch him. Guster disappears, glad to get out of the shop, which she regards with mingled dread and veneration as a storehouse of awful implements of the great torture of the law, a place not to be entered after the gas is turned off. Mr. Snagsby appears, greasy, warm, herbaceous, and chewing, bolts a bit of bread and butter, and says, "Bless my soul, sir, Mr. Tulkinghorn." "I want a word with you, Snagsby." "Certainly, sir. Dear me, sir, why didn't you send your young man round for me? Pray walk into the back of the shop, sir." Snagsby has brightened in a moment. The confined room of strong parchment grease is warehouse, counting house, and copying office. Mr. Tulkinghorn sits facing round on a stool at the desk. "Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Snagsby." "Yes, sir." Mr. Snagsby turns up the gas, coughs behind his hand, modestly anticipating profit. Mr. Snagsby, as a timid man, is accustomed to cough with a variety of expressions, and so to save words. "You copied some affidavits in that course for me lately." "Yes, sir, we did." "There was one of them," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, carelessly feeling, tight, unopenable oyster of the old school, "in the wrong coat pocket, the handwriting of which is peculiar and I rather like. As I happened to be passing, and thought I had it about me, I looked in to ask you, but I haven't got it. No matter, any other time will do. Ah, here it is. I looked in to ask you who copied this." "Who copied this, sir?" says Mr. Snagsby, taking it, laying it flat on the desk, and separating all the sheets at once with a twirl and a twist of the left hand, peculiar to law stationers. "We gave this out, sir. We were giving out rather a large quantity of work just at that time. I can tell you in a moment who copied it, sir, by referring to my book." Mr. Snagsby takes his book down from the safe, makes another bolt of the bit of bread and butter which seemed to have stopped short, eyes the affidavit aside, and brings his right forefinger travelling down a page to the book. "Juby, Packer, Jarndyce, here we are, sir," says Mr. Snagsby. "To be sure, I might have remembered it. This was given out, sir, to a writer who lodges just over on the opposite side of the lane." Mr. Tulkinghorn has seen the entry, found it before the law stationer, read it while the forefinger was coming down the hill. "What do you call him, Nemo?" says Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Nemo, sir. Here it is, 42 folio. Given out at Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. Brought in on the Thursday morning at 9:30. "Nemo," repeats Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Nemo is Latin for no one." "It must be English for some one, sir, I think." Mr. Snagsby submits with his deferential cough. "It's a person's name. Here it is, you see, sir, 42 folio. Given out Wednesday night, 8 o'clock. Brought in Thursday morning, 9:30. The tail of Mr. Snagsby's eye becomes conscious of the head of Mrs. Snagsby looking in at the shop door to know what he means by deserting his tea. Mr. Snagsby addresses an explanatory cough to Mrs. Snagsby, as who should say, "My dear, a customer." "9:30, sir," repeats Mr. Snagsby. "Our law writers, who live by job work, are a queer lot, and this may not be his name, but it is the name he goes by. I remember now, sir, that he gives it a written advertisement. He sticks it up down at the Rule Office, and the King's Bench Office, and the Judges' Chambers, and so forth. You know the kind of document, sir, wanting employ." Mr. Tulkinghorn glances through the little window at the back of Covens's, the sheriff's offices, where the lights shine in Covens's windows. Covens's coffee room is at the back, and the shadows of several gentlemen under a cloud loom cloudily upon the blinds. Mr. Snagsby takes the opportunity of slightly turning his head to glance over his shoulder at his little woman, and to make apologetic motions with his mouth to this effect: "Tulkinghorn, rich, influential." "Have you given this man work before?" asks Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Oh dear, yes, sir, work of yours." "Thinking of more important matters, I forget where you said he lived." "Across the lane, sir. In fact, he lodges at a—" Mr. Snagsby makes another bolt, as if the bit of bread and butter were insurmountable. "At a rag and bottle shop." "Can you show me the place as I go back?" "With the greatest pleasure, sir." Mr. Snagsby pulls off his sleeves and his grey coat, puts on his black coat, takes his hat from its peg. "Oh, here is my little woman," he says aloud. My dear, will you be so kind as to tell one of the lads to look after the shop while I step across the lane with Mr. Tulkinghorn? Mrs. Snagsby, sir. I shan't be 2 minutes, my love." Mrs. Snagsby bends to the lawyer, retires behind the counter, peeps at them through the window blind, goes softly into the back office, refers to the entries in the book still lying open, is evidently curious. "You will find that the place is rough, sir," says Mr. Snagsby, walking deferentially in the road and leaving the narrow pavement to the lawyer. "And the party is very rough. But they're a wild lot in general, sir. The advantage of this particular man is that he never wants sleep. He'll go at it right on end if you want him to, as long as ever you like." It is quite dark now, and the gas lamps have acquired their full effect, jostling against clerks going to post the day's letters, and against counsel and attorneys going home to dinner, and against plaintiffs and defendants, and suitors of all sorts, and against the general crowd, in whose way the forensic wisdom of ages has interposed a million of obstacles to the transaction of the commonest business of life, diving through law and equity, and through that kindred mystery, the street mud, which is made of nobody knows what, and collects about us nobody knows whence or how, we only knowing in general that when there is too much of it, we find it necessary to shovel it away. The lawyer and the law stationer come to a rag and bottle shop and general emporium of much disregarded merchandise, lying and being in the shadow of the wall of Lincoln's Inn, and kept, as is announced in paint, to all whom it may concern, by one crook. "This is where he lives, sir," says the law stationer. "This is where he lives, is it?" says the lawyer unconcernedly. "Thank you. Are you not going in, sir?" "No, thank you. I'm going on to the fields at present. Good evening, thank you." Mr. Snagsby lifts his hat and returns to his little woman and his tea. But Mr. Tulkinghorn does not go on to the fields at present. He goes a short way, turns back, comes again to the shop of Mr. Crook, and enters it straight. It's dim enough, with a blot-headed candle or so in the windows, and an old man and a cat sitting in the back part by a fire. The old man rises and comes forward with another blot-headed candle in his hand. "Pray, is your lodger within?" "Male or female, sir?" says Mr. Crook. "Male, the person who does copying." Mr. Crook has eyed his man narrowly, knows him by sight, has an indistinct impression of his aristocratic repute. "Do you wish to see him, sir?" "Yes." "It's what I seldom do myself," says Mr. Crook with a grin. "Shall I call him down? But it's a weak chance if he'd come, sir." "I'll go up to him then," says Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Second floor, sir. Take the candle up there." Mr. Crook, with his cat beside him, stands at the bottom of the staircase, looking after Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Aye, aye," he says, when Mr. Tulkinghorn's nearly disappeared. The lawyer looks down over the handrail. The cat expands her wicked mouth and snarls at him. "Order, Lady Jane. Behave yourself to visitors, my lady. You know what they say of my lodger," whispers Crook, going up a step or two. "What do they say of him?" "They say he has sold himself to the enemy. But you and I know better. He don't buy. I'll tell you what, though, my lodger is so black-humoured and gloomy that I believe he'd as soon make that bargain as any other. Don't put him out, sir. That's my advice." Mr. Tulkinghorn, with a nod, goes on his way. He comes to the dark door on the second floor. He knocks, receives no answer, opens it, and accidentally extinguishes his candle in doing so. The air of the room is almost bad enough to have extinguished it if he had not. It is a small room, nearly black with soot and grease and dirt. In the rusty skeleton of a grate, pinched at the middle as if poverty had gripped it, a red coke fire burns low. In the corner by the chimney stand, a deal table and a broken desk, a wilderness marked with rain of ink. In another corner, a ragged old portmanteau on one of the two chairs serves for cabinet or wardrobe. No larger one is needed, for it collapses like the cheeks of a starved man. The floor is bare, except that one old mat, trodden to shreds of rope yarn, lies perishing upon the hearth. No curtain veils the darkness of the night, but the discoloured shutters are drawn together, and through the two gaunt holes pierced in them, famine might be staring in, the banshee of the man upon the bed. For on a low bed opposite the fire, a confusion of dirty patchwork, lean ribbed, tickling and coarse sacking. The lawyer, hesitating just within the doorway, sees a man. He lies there dressed in shirt and trousers with bare feet. He has a yellow look in the spectral darkness of a candle that has guttered down until the whole length of its wick, still burning, has doubled over and left a tower of a winding sheet above it. His hair is ragged, mingling with his whiskers and his beard, the latter ragged too, and grown like the scum and mist around him in neglect. Foul and filthy as the room is, foul and filthy as the air is, it is not easy to perceive what fumes those are which most oppress the senses in it. But through the general sickness and faintness and the odour of stale tobacco, there comes into the lawyer's mouth the bitter, vapid taste of opium. "Hello, my friend," he cries, and strikes his iron candlestick against the door. He thinks he has awakened his friend. He lies a little turned away, but his eyes are surely open. "Hello, my friend," he cries again. "Hello, hello." As he rattles the door, the candle which has drooped so long goes out and leaves him in the dark, with the gaunt eyes in the shutters staring down upon the bed. Chapter 11. Our Dear Brother. A touch on the lawyer's wrinkled hand as he stands in the dark room, irresolute, makes him start and say, "What's that?" "It's me," returns the old man of the house, whose breath is in his ear. "Can't you wake him?" "No." "What have you done with your candle?" "It's gone out. Here it is." Crook takes it, goes to the fire, stoops over the red embers, and tries to get a light. The dying ashes have no light to spare, and his endeavours are in vain. Muttering after an ineffectual call to his lodger that he will go downstairs and bring a lighted candle from the shop, the old man departs. Mr. Tulkinghorn, for some new reason that he has, does not await his return in the room, but on the stairs outside. The welcome light soon shines upon the wall as Crook comes slowly up with his green-eyed cat following at his heels. "Does the man generally sleep like this?" inquired the lawyer in a low voice. I don't know," says Crook, shaking his head and lifting his eyebrows. "I know next to nothing of his habits, except that he keeps himself very close." Thus whispering, they both go in together. As the light goes in, the great eyes in the shutters, darkening, seem to close. Not so the eyes upon the bed. "God save us!" exclaims Mr. Tulkinghorn. "He's dead." Crook drops the heavy hand he has taken up so suddenly that the arm swings over the bedside. They look at one another for a moment. "Send for some doctor. Call for Miss Flite upstairs, sir. Here's poison by the bed. Call out for Flite, will you?" says Crook, with his lean hands spread out above the body like vampires' wings. Mr. Tulkinghorn hurries to the landing and calls, "Miss Flite, Miss Flite, make haste. Here, whoever you are, Flite." Crook follows him with his eyes, and while he is calling, finds an opportunity to steal the old portmanteau and steal back again. "Run, Flite, run! The nearest doctor, run!" So Mr. Crook addresses a crazy little woman who is his female lodger, who appears and vanishes in a breath, who soon returns, accompanied by a testy medical man brought from his dinner, with a broad snuffy upper lip and a broad Scotch brogue. "Ay, bless her heart to ye," says the medical man, looking up at them after a moment's examination. "He's just as dead as fairy." Mr. Tulkinghorn, standing by the old portmanteau, inquires if he has been dead any time. "Any time, sir," says the medical man. "It's probable he will have been dead for about 3 hours." "About that time, I should say," observes a dark young man on the other side of the bed. "Are you in the medical profession yourself, sir?" inquires the first. The dark young man says yes. "Then I'll just tak my departure," replies the other, "for I'm nae good here." With which remark he finishes his brief attendance and returns to finish his dinner. The dark young surgeon passes the candle across the face and carefully examines the law writer, who has established his pretensions to his name by becoming indeed no one. "I knew this person by sight very well," says he. "He has purchased opium off me for the last year and a half. Was anybody present related to him?" glancing round upon the 3 bystanders. "I was his landlord," grimly answers Crook, taking the candle from the surgeon's outstretched hand. "He told me once I was the nearest relation he had." "He has died," says the surgeon, "of an overdose of opium, there is no doubt." The room is strongly flavoured with it. There is enough here now," taking an old teapot from Mr. Crook, "to kill a dozen people." "Do you think he did it on purpose?" asked Crook. "Took the overdose?" "Yes." Crook almost smacks his lips with the unction of a horrible interest. "I can't say. I should think it unlikely, as he's been in the habit of taking so much. But nobody can tell. He was very poor, I suppose." "I suppose he was. His room don't look rich," says Crook, who might have changed eyes with his cat as he casts his sharp glance around. "But I've never been in it since he had it, and he was too close to name his circumstances to me." "Did he owe you any rent?" "6 weeks." "He will never pay it," says the young man, resuming his examination. "It is beyond a doubt that he is indeed as dead as Pharaoh, and to judge from his appearance and condition, I should think it a happy release. He must have been a good figure when a youth, and I dare say good looking." He says this not unfeelingly, while sitting on the bedside's edge, with his face towards that other face, and his hand upon the region of the heart. I recollect once thinking there was something in his manner, uncouth as it was, that denoted a fall in life. Was that so? He continues, looking around. Crook replies, "You may as well ask me to describe the ladies whose heads of hair I've got in the sacks downstairs. Than that he was my lodger for a year and a half, and lived, or didn't live, by law writing, I know no more of him." During this dialogue Mr. Tulkinghorn stood aloof by the old portmanteau, with his hands behind him, equally removed, to all appearance, from all three kinds of interests exhibited near the bed, from the young surgeon's professional interest in death, noticeable as being quite apart from his remarks on the deceased as an individual, from the old man's unction, and the little crazy woman's awe. His imperturbable face has been as inexpressive as his rusty clothes. One could not even say he has been thinking all this while. He has shown neither patience nor impatience, nor attention nor abstraction. He has shown nothing but his shell. As easily might the tone of a delicate musical instrument be inferred from its case, as the tone of Mr. Tulkinghorn from his case. He now interposes, addressing the young surgeon in his unmoved professional way. "I looked in here," he observes, "just before you, with the intention of giving this deceased man, whom I never saw alive, some employment at his trade of copying. I had heard of him from my stationer, Snagsby, of Cook's Court. Since no one here knows anything about him, it might be as well to send for Snagsby." "Ah!" to the crazy little woman who has often seen him in court, and whom he has often seen, and who proposes, in a frightened dumb show, to go to the law stationer. "Suppose you do." While she is gone, the surgeon abandons his hopeless investigation, and covers its subject with a patchwork counterpane. Mr. Crook and he interchange a word or two. Mr. Tulkinghorn says nothing, but stands ever near the old portmanteau. Mr. Snagsby arrives hastily in his grey coat and his black sleeves. Dear me, he says, and it has come to this, has it? Oh, bless my soul!" "Can you give the person of the house any information about this unfortunate creature, Snagsby?" inquires Mr. Tulkinghorn. "He was in arrears with his rent, it seems, and he must be buried, you know." "Well, sir," says Mr. Snagsby, coughing his apologetic cough behind his hand, "I really don't know what advice I could offer except sending for the beadle." "I don't speak of advice," returns Mr. Tulkinghorn. "I could advise." "No one better, sir, I'm sure," says Mr. Snagsby, with his deferential cough. "I speak of affording some clue to his connections, or to where he came from, or to anything concerning him. I assure you, sir," says Mr. Snagsby, after prefacing his reply with his cough of general propitiation, "that I no more know where he came from than I know—" "Where he has gone to, perhaps," suggests the surgeon to help him out. A pause. Mr. Tulkinghorn looking at the law stationer. Mr. Crook with his mouth open, looking for somebody to speak next. "As to his connections, sir," says Mr. Snagsby, "if a person was to say to me, 'Snagsby, here's £20,000 down, ready for you in the Bank of England if you'll only name one of them,' I couldn't do it, sir. About a year and a half ago, to the best of my belief, the time when he first came to lodge at the present rag and bottle shop." "That was the time," says Crook with a nod. "About a year and a half ago," says Mr. Snagsby, strengthened He came into our place one morning after breakfast, and finding my little woman, which I named Mrs. Snagsby when I used that appellation, in our shop, produced a specimen of his handwriting, and gave her to understand that he was in want of copying work to do, and was not to put too fine a point upon it. A favourite apology for plain speaking with Mr. Snagsby, which he always offers with a sort of argumentative frankness. Hard up, my little woman is not in general partial to strangers, particular not to put too fine a point upon it when they want anything, but she was rather took by something about this person, whether his being unshaved, or by his hair being in want of attention, or by what other ladies' reasons, I leave you to judge, and she accepted of the specimen, and likewise of the address. My little woman hasn't a good ear for names, proceeds Mr. Snagsby, after consulting his cough of consideration behind his hand, and she considered Nemo equally the same as Nimrod, in consequence of which she got into the habit of saying to me at meals, "Mr. Snagsby, have you found Nimrod any work yet?" Or, "Mr. Snagsby, why didn't you give that 8 and 30 Chancery folio in Jarndyce to Nimrod?" or such like. And that is the way he gradually fell into job work at our place. And that is the most I know of him, except that he was a quick hand, and a hand not sparing of night work, and that if you gave him out, say, at 5 and 40 folio on the Wednesday night, you would have it brought in on Thursday morning. All of which, Mr. Snagsby concludes by pointedly motioning with his hat towards the bed, as much as to add, I have no doubt my honourable friend would confirm if he were in a condition to do it. "Hadn't you better see," says Mr. Tulkinghorn to cook, "whether he had any papers that may enlighten you? There will be an inquest, and you will be asked the question. You can read?" "No, I can't," returns the old man with a sudden grin. "Snagsby," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, "look over the room for him. He will get into some trouble or difficulty otherwise. Being here, I'll wait if you make haste, and then I can testify on his behalf, if it should ever be necessary, that all was fair and right. And you will hold the candle for Mr. Snagsby, my friend. He'll soon see whether there's anything to help you." "In the first place, here's an old portmanteau, sir," says Snagsby. "Ah, to be sure, so there is. Mr. Tulkinghorn does not appear to have seen it before, though he is standing so close to it, and though there is very little else, heaven knows." The marine store merchant holds the light, and the law stationer conducts the search. The surgeon leans against the corner of the chimney-piece. Miss Flite peeps and trembles just within the door. The apt old scholar of the old school, with his dull black breeches tied with ribbons at the knees, his large black waistcoat, his long-sleeved black coat, and his wisp of a limp white handkerchief tied in the bow the peerage knows so well, stands in the exact same place and attitude. There are some worthless articles of clothing in the old portmanteau. There is a bundle of pawnbrokers' duplicates, those turnpike tickets on the road of poverty. There is a crumpled paper smelling of opium, on which are scrawled rough memoranda, as took such a day, so many grains, took such another day, so many more, begun some time ago, as if with the intention of being regularly continued, but soon left off. There are a few dirty scraps of newspapers, all referring to coroners' inquests. There is nothing else. They search the cupboard and the drawer of the ink-splashed table. There is not a morsel of an old letter, or of any other writing in either. The young surgeon examines the dress on the law writer. A knife and some odd halfpence are all he finds. Mr. Snagsby's suggestion is the practical suggestion after all, and the beadle must be called in. So the crazy little lodger goes out for the beadle, and the rest come out of the room. "Don't leave the cat there," says the surgeon. "That won't do." Mr. Crook therefore drives her out before him, and she goes furtively downstairs, winding her lithe tail and licking her lips. "Good night," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, and goes home to allegory and meditation. By this time the news has got into court. Groups of its inhabitants assemble to discuss the thing, and the outposts of the army of observation, principally boys, are pushed forward to Mr. Crook's window, which they closely invest. A policeman has already walked up to the room, and walked down again to the door, where he stands like a tower, only condescending to see the boys at his base occasionally, but whenever he does see them they quail and fall back. Mrs. Perkins, who has not been seen for some weeks on speaking terms with Mrs. Piper, in consequence for an unpleasantness originating in young Perkins having, fetched young piper a crack, renews her friendly intercourse on this auspicious occasion. The pot boy at the corner, who is a privileged amateur, as possessing official knowledge of life and having to deal with drunken men occasionally, exchanges confidential communications with the policeman, and has the appearance of impregnable youth, unassailable by truncheons, and unconfinable in station houses. People talk across the court out of a window, and bareheaded scouts come hurrying in from Chancery Lane to know what's the matter. The general feeling seems to be that it's a blessing Mr. Crook warn't made with first, mingled with a little natural disappointment that he was not. In the midst of this sensation, the beadle arrives. The beadle, though generally understood in the neighbourhood to be a ridiculous institution, is not without a certain popularity for the moment, if it were only as a man who is going to see the body. The policeman considers him an imbecile civilian, a remnant of the barbarous watchman times, but gives him admission as something that must be borne with until government shall abolish him. The sensation is heightened as the tidings spread from mouth to mouth that the beadle is on the ground and has gone in. By and by the beadle comes out, once more intensifying the sensation, which has rather languished in the interval. He is understood to be in want of witnesses for the inquest to-morrow, who can tell the coroner and jury anything whatever respecting the deceased. It is immediately referred to innumerable people who can tell nothing whatever. It is made more imbecile by being constantly informed that Mrs. Green's son was a law writer himself, and knowed him better than anybody, which son of Mrs. Green's appears on inquiry to be at the present time aboard a vessel bound for China, 3 months out, but considered accessible by telegraph on application to the Lords of the Admiralty. Beadle goes into various shops and parlours, examining the inhabitants, always shutting the door first, and by exclusion, delay, and general idiocy, exasperating the public. The policeman seen to smile to the pot boy. Public loses interest and undergoes reaction. Taunts the beadle in shrill youthful voices with having boiled a boy. Choruses fragments of a popular song to that effect, importing that the boy was made into soup for the workhouse. Policeman at last finds it necessary to support the law, and seize a vocalist, who is released upon the flight of the rest on condition of his getting out of this, then come and cutting it, a condition he immediately observes. So the sensation dies off for the time, and the unmoved policeman, to whom a little opium more or less is nothing, with his shining hat, stiff stock, inflexible greatcoat, stout belt and bracelet, and all things fitting, pursues his lounging way with heavy tread, beating the palms of his white gloves one against the other, and stopping now and then at a street corner to look casually about for anything between a lost child and a murder. Under cover of the night, the feeble-minded beadle comes flitting about Chancery Lane with his summonses, in which every juror's name is wrongly spelt, and nothing rightly spelt but the beadle's own name, which nobody can read or wants to know. The summons is served and his witnesses forewarned. The beadle goes to Mr. Crook's to keep a small appointment he has made with certain paupers, who, presently arriving, are conducted upstairs, where they leave the great eyes in the shutter something new to stare at, in that last shape which earthly lodgings take for no one, and for every one. And all that night the coffin stands ready by the old portmanteau, and the lonely figure on the bed, whose path in life has lain through 45 years, lies there with no more track behind him that any one can trace than a deserted infant. Next day the court is all alive, is like a fair, as Mrs. Perkins, more than reconciled to Mrs. Piper, says in an amicable conversation with that excellent woman. The coroner is to sit in the first-floor room at the Soul's Arms, where the harmonic meetings take place twice a week, and where the chair is filled by a gentleman of professional celebrity, faced by Little Swills, a comic vocalist, who hopes, according to the bill in the window, that his friends will rally round him and support first-rate talent. The Soul's Arms does a brisk stroke of business all morning. Even children so require sustaining under the general excitement that a pieman, who has established himself for the occasion at the corner of the court, says his brandy balls go off like smoke. What time the beadle, hovering between the door of Mr. Crook's establishment and the door of the Soul's Arms, shows the curiosity in his keeping to a few discreet spirits, and accepts the compliment of a glass of ale or so in return. At the appointed hour arrives the coroner, for whom the jurymen are waiting, and who is received with a salute of skittles from the good dry skittle ground attached to the Soul's Arms. The coroner frequents more public houses than any man alive. The smell of sawdust, beer, tobacco smoke, and spirits is inseparable in his vocation from death in its most awful shapes. He is conducted by the beadle and the landlord to the harmonic meeting room, where he puts his hat on the piano and takes a Windsor chair at the head of a long table formed of several short tables put together and ornamented with glutinous rings in endless involutions made by pots and glasses. As many of the jury as can crowd together at the table sit there. The rest get among the spittoons and pipes or lean against the piano. Over the coroner's head is a small iron garland, the pendant handle of a bell, which rather gives the majesty of the court the appearance of going to be hanged presently. Call over and swear the jury. While the ceremony is in progress, sensation is created by the entrance of a chubby little man in a large shirt collar with a moist eye and an inflamed nose, who modestly takes the position near the door as one of the general public, but seems familiar with the room too. A whisper circulates that this is little Swills. It is considered not unlikely that he will get up in imitation of the corridor and make it the principal feature of the harmonic meeting in the evening. "Well, gentlemen," the coroner begins. "Silence there, will you?" says the beadle, not to the coroner, though it might appear so. "Well, gentlemen," resumes the coroner, "you are impanelled here to inquire into the death of a certain man. Evidence will be given before you as to the circumstances attending that death, and you will give your verdict according to the skittles. They must be stopped, you know, beadle. Evidence, and not according to anything else. The first thing to be done is to view the body." "Make way there," cries the beadle. So they go out in a loose procession, something after the manner of a straggling funeral, and make their inspection in Mr. Crook's back second floor, on which a few of the jurymen retire pale and precipitately. The beadle is very careful that two gentlemen, not very neat about the cuffs and buttons, for whose accommodation he has provided a special little table near the corner in the harmonic meeting room, should see all that is to be seen, for they are the public chroniclers of such inquiries by the line, and he is not superior to the universal human infirmity, but hopes to read in print what Mooney, the active and intelligent beadle of the district, said and did, and even aspires to see the name of Mooney as familiarly and patronizingly mentioned as the name of the hangman is, according to the latest examples. Little Swills is waiting for the coroner and jury on their return. Mr. Tulkinghorn also. Mr. Tulkinghorn is received with distinction and seated near the coroner, between that high judicial officer, a bagatelle board, and the coal box. The inquiry proceeds. The jury learn how the subject of their inquiry died, and learn no more about him. "A very eminent solicitor is in attendance, gentlemen," says the coroner, "who I am informed was accidentally present when discovery of the death was made. But he could only repeat the evidence you have already heard from the surgeon, the landlord, the lodger, and the law stationer, and it is not necessary to trouble him. Is anybody in attendance who knows anything more?" Mrs. Piper, pushed forward by Mrs. Perkins. Mrs. Piper sworn. "Anastasia Piper, gentlemen, married woman. Now, Mrs. Piper, what have you got to say about this?" Mrs. Piper has a good deal to say, chiefly in parenthesis and without punctuation, but not much to tell. Mrs. Piper lives in the court, which her husband is a cabinet maker, and it has long been well known among the neighbours, counting from the day next but one before the half baptizing of Alexander James Piper, aged 18 months and 4 days old, on accounts of not being expected to live. Such was the sufferings, gentlemen, of that child in his gums, as the plaintiff, so Mrs. Piper insists on calling the deceased, was reported to have sold himself. Thinks it was the plaintiff's air in which that report originated in. See the plaintiff often, seeing as his air was ferocious and not to be allowed to go about some children being timid, and if doubted, hoping Mrs. Perkins may be brought forward, for she is here and would do credit to her husband, herself, and her family. Has seen the plaintiff vexed and worrited by the children, for children they will ever be, and you cannot expect them, especially if of playful dispositions, to be Methuselah's, which you was not yourself. On accounts of this and his dark looks, has often dreamed as she sees him, never, however, see the plaintiff take a pickaxe or any other weapon, far from it. Has seen him hurry away when run and called after, as if not partial to children, and never see him speak to neither child nor grown person at any time, excepting the boy that sweeps the crossing down the lane over the way round the corner, which, if he was here, would tell you that he has been seen as speaking to him frequent. Says the coroner, is that boy here? Says the beadle, no, sir, he's not here. Says the coroner, go and fetch him then. In the absence of the active and intelligent, the coroner converses with Mr. Tulkinghorn. Oh, here's the boy, gentlemen. Here he is, very muddy, very hoarse, very ragged. Now, boy, but stop a minute, caution. This boy must be put through a few preliminary paces. Name Joe, nothing else that he knows on. Don't know that everybody has two names. Never heard of such a thing. Don't know that Joe is short for a longer name. Thinks it long enough for him. He don't find no fault with it. Spell it? No, he can't spell it. No father, no mother, no friends, never been to school. What's home? Knows a broom's a broom, and knows it's wicked to tell a lie. Don't recollect who told him about the broom or about the lie, but he knows both. Can't say exactly what will be done to him after he's dead if he tells a lie to the gentleman here, but believes it. Be something very bad to punish him, and serve him right, so he'll tell the truth. This won't do, gentlemen, says the coroner with a melancholy shake of his head. Don't you think you can receive his evidence, sir? Says an attentive juryman. Out of the question, says the coroner. You have heard the boy. Can't exactly say won't do, you know. You can't take that in a court of justice, gentlemen. It's terrible depravity. Put the boy aside. Boy put aside, to the great edification of the audience, especially of little Swills, the comic vocalist. Now, is there any other witnesses? No other witnesses? Very well, gentlemen. Here's a man unknown, proved to have been in the habit of taking opium in large quantities for a year and a half, found dead of too much opium. If you think you have any evidence to lead you to the conclusion that he committed suicide, you will come to that conclusion. If you think this is a case of accidental death, you will find verdict accordingly. Verdict accordingly. Accidental death. No doubt, gentlemen, you are discharged. Good afternoon. While the coroner buttons his greatcoat, Mr. Tulkinghorn and he give private audience to the rejected witness in a corner. That graceless creature only knows that the dead man, whom he recognised just now by his yellow face and black hair, was sometimes hooted and pursued about the streets. That one cold winter night when he, the boy, was shivering in a doorway near his crossing, the man turned to look at him and came back, and having questioned him and found that he had not a friend in the world, said, "Neither have I, not one," and gave him the price of a supper and a night's lodging. That the man had often spoken to him since and asked him whether he slept sound at night, and how he bore cold and hunger, and whether he ever wished to die, and similar strange questions. That when the man had no money, he would say in passing, "I'm as poor as you today, Joe," but that when he had any, he always, as the boy most heartily believes, been glad to give him some. "He was very good to me," says the boy, wiping his eyes with his wretched sleeve. "When I see him a-lying so stretched out just now, I wish he could have heard me tell him. He was so very good to me. He was." As he shuffled downstairs, Mr. Snagsby, lying in wait for him, puts a half-crown in his hand. "If you ever see me coming past your crossing with my little woman, I mean a lady," says Mr. Snagsby with his finger on his nose, "don't allude to it." For some little time the jurymen hung about the Soul's Arms colloquially. In the sequel, half a dozen are caught up in a cloud of pipe smoke that pervades the parlour of the Soul's Arms. 2 stroll to Hampstead, 4 engage to go half price to the play at night and top up with oysters. Little Swills is treated on several hands, being asked what he thinks of the procedures, characterises them, his strength lying in slangular direction, as a rummy start. The landlord of the Soul's Arms, finding Little Swills so popular, commends him highly to the jurymen and public, observing that for a song in character he don't know his equal, and that man's character wardrobe would fill a cart. Thus gradually the Soul's Arms melts into the shadowy night, and then flares out of it, strong in gas. The harmonic meeting are arriving. The gentleman of professional celebrity takes the chair, is faced, red-faced, by Little Swills. Their friends rally round them and support first-rate talent. In the zenith of the evening, little Swill says, "Gentlemen, if you'll permit me, I'll attempt a short description of a scene of real life that came off here today." Is much applauded and encouraged. Goes out of the room as Swills. Comes in as the coroner, not in the least in the world like him. Describes the inquest with recreative intervals of pianoforte accompaniment to the refrain with his, the coroner's, "Tippy-toll, lil doll, tippy-toll, low doll, tippy-too, dolly dee." The jingling piano at last is silent, and the harmonic friends rally round their pillows. Then there is rest around the lonely figure now laid in its last earthly habitation, and is watched by the gaunt eyes in the shutters through some quiet hours of night. If this forlorn man could have been prophetically seen lying here by the mother at whose breast he nestled, a little child with eyes upraised to a loving face, and soft hands scarcely knowing how to close upon the neck to which it crept, what an impossibility the vision would have seemed. Oh, if in brighter days the now extinguished fire within him ever burned for one woman who held him in her heart, where is she, while these ashes are above the ground? It is anything but a night of rest at Mr. Snagsby's in Cook's Court, where Guster murders sleep by going, as Mr. Snagsby himself allows, not to put too fine a point upon it, out of one fit into 20. The occasion of this Caesar is that Guster has a tender heart, and a susceptible something that possibly might have been imagination, but for Tooting and her patron saint. Be it what it may, now it was so direfully impressed at tea time by Mr. Snagsby's account of the inquiry at which he had assisted, that at supper time she projected herself into the kitchen, preceded by a flying Dutch cheese, and fell into a fit of unusual duration, which she only came out of to go into another and another, and so on through a chain of fits, with short intervals in between, of which she has pathetically availed herself by consuming them in entreaties to Mrs. Snagsby not to give a warning when she quite comes to, and also appeals to the whole establishment to lay her down on the stones and go to bed. Hence Mr. Snagsby at last, hearing the cock at the little dairy in Cursitor Street go into that disinterested ecstasy of his on the subject of daylight, says, drawing a long breath, though the most patient of men, "I thought you was dead, I'm sure." What question this enthusiastic fowl supposes he settles when he strains himself to such an extent, or why he should thus crow. So men crow on various triumphant public occasions, however, about what cannot be of any moment to him. It is his affair. It is enough that daylight comes, morning comes, and noon comes. Then the active and intelligent, who has got into the morning papers as such, comes with his pauper company to Mr. Crook's, and bears off the body of our dear brother here departed to a hemmed-in churchyard, pestiferous and obscene, whence malignant diseases are communicated to the bodies of our dear brothers and sisters who have not departed, while our dear brothers and sisters who hang about official back stairs, would to heaven they had departed, are very complacent and agreeable, into a beastly scrap of ground which a Turk would reject as a savage abomination and a Kaffir would shudder at. They bring our dear brother here departed to receive Christian burial, with houses looking on every side, save where a reeking little tunnel of a court gives access to the iron gate, with every villainy of life in action close on death, and every poisonous element of death in action close on life. Here they lower our dear brother down a foot or two, here sow him in corruption to be raised in corruption, an avenging ghost at many a sick bedside, a shameful testimony to future ages how civilization and barbarism walk this boastful island together. Come night, come darkness, for you cannot come too soon or stay too long by such a place as this. Come straggling lights into the windows of the ugly houses, and you who do iniquity therein, do it at least with this dread scene shut out. Come, flame of gas burning so sullenly above the iron gate, on which the poisoned air deposits its witch ointment, slimy to the touch. It is well that you should call to every passer-by, "Look here." It then, with an old broom it carries, softly sweeps the step and makes the archway clean. It does so very busily and trimly, looks in again a little while, and so departs. Joe, is it thou? Well, well. Though a rejected witness who can't exactly say what would be done to him in greater hands than men's, thou art not quite in outer darkness. There is something like a distant ray of light in thy muttered reason for this. He was werry good to me, he was.